So one of the more loved styles of architecture is Gothic. And there was later a Gothic revival where it was brought back, and the original Gothic was more churches. The Gothic revival was more residential. If I can get there, I will show you. Okay. So yeah, this obviously is a cathedral, and the one of the reasons that Gothic was so familiar or so common in large buildings is because it allowed us to now get taller. Up until now, we have mostly been working with stacking things. And at this point in construction, stacking things will only let you go so high before you have to start making your walls thicker and thicker. And then it becomes impossible to have what you see here, because one of the reasons that the this was used in churches was because it was a new type of system that allowed them to use large windows to get in a lot of light, but it also allowed them to create very voluminous spaces, because part of the message that the churches wanted to send, that built these churches, to their patronages was this grandiosity of their religion. And it also has a psychological effect of making you feel small in the house of God. So that was part of the approach they were going for with these. So you're going to see this in castles, palaces, town halls, universities, very large buildings. There's not a lot in residential, but I will show you a palace. Some of the styles of Gothic architecture is it's very, very vertical, right? When you look at this, you see a lot of vertical lines, not so much horizontal, very vertical. There's a skeletal structureness to it, great expanses of glass. We now have our arches are pointed. That is purely an attribute of Gothic, pointed arches. So you will see the arch is now pointed. Ribbed vaults, clustered columns, spires. I'll show you what a buttress is in a minute. And very, very sculptural details. This is very detailed, very, very lacy looking. And we'll talk about gargoyles because those are cool. So there are two things here, a buttress and a flying buttress. And a buttress is something that is up against the building. And when we put the buttresses up against the walls, it allows the walls to remain thin but get taller, because now the structural load is being carried down those buttresses. So it's almost like a giant column attached to a wall. That's the best way you could probably think about it. And that's what began to happen. And you can see we're starting to get really, really tall here, right? Before we were doing one, maybe 2 stories. Now we're getting, dozens of feet in the air. A flying buttress is when there is this bridge from the main structure. So this is a buttress, but then this becomes a flying buttress because it's attached through these wings, as you will. And what that allows physically is it allows you to go even taller, because now the weight is not just transferring down here, but it's allowing. Okay, so what happens is when you have a very tall structure like that, at some point the torque is going to get so great that these things become unbuildable too. You start having walls. And that's kind of what's happened. So in order to hold the wall in place and resist the torque, and the torque is at the base of the wall, and it would cause the wall to start to push out this way. Think about it like this. So think of the wall, and the base of the wall is the pivot point, and the top of the wall is going to want to fall over. That's torque. Okay. If you think about using a wrench, that's torque. Torque centers about the bolt when you put the wrench on it, and then the longer the arm, the more pressure you put, the easier it is to turn that wrench. Well, the same thing here. The taller we get, the more weight on that wall is going to push down and away from the foundation, and the wall is going to fall over. So the flying buttress now allowed them to put these outliers with wings that they rigged so that it would prevent the torque from knocking the wall over, and allow them to go even higher. And in plant elevation in section view, you can see this is how tall they got compared to a person down here. And this is one buttress, this is a flying buttress, and this is a third flying buttress. That's how they're able to go so tall, with stacked masonry. Now, remember, this is before we have steel or rebar. We are still at this point, anything that is metal at this point is still small. So they are basically stacking bricks or stacking stones. And those materials are not strong enough to be able to, on their own, do what they wanted to do, which was go tall without falling over. And my professor in college said, basically, unfortunately, they had hundreds of years of buildings falling over to learn this. And you can see this is Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, and there's just some parts and pieces that are associated with Gothic design. And Gothic architecture evolved out of Romanesque by going higher and having more windows. So you're going to see a lot more windows. Also, the arch got pointy. Okay, so gargoyles, very quickly, really not a lot of gargoyles on houses, but you might find them in the garden. Sometimes you do find them on the larger palaces. And here are some examples of gargoyles. And these are not gargoyles, and I will tell you the difference, how you can tell the difference. Also not a gargoyle. I thought I had more pictures of gargoyles. These are that might, no, that's not a gargoyle either. Okay, gargoyle technically comes from the French word throat. A true gargoyle is a water spout. It literally carries water down a pipe, comes down to water through and out the throat of the gargoyle, and the mouth will be open like this one. He's not a gargoyle, but other gargoyles in here. But water will come out when it rains. In Latin, the word also not only means throat, but it means the gurgling sound water makes as it passes out. Because if you stand there and listen closely, it gurgles. So gargoyle just means gurgle or throat. A carved creature that does not serve the purpose of a drain pipe is called a grotesque. So these are grotesques, and these are gargoyles. You see, what happens is there's inside this wall, there's a pipe that comes out, and then it drains, and water will flow out of that gargoyle and away from the building. But this was smart. Because we now have had hundreds and thousands of years of humans trying to build stuff and failing. And, we don't talk much about that, but the truth is stuff fell a lot and unfortunately killed people. And so we figured out how not to do that. And we're starting to see the fruits of those very creative solutions to preventing buildings from falling over. Yep, so this is a true gargoyle. These are all grotesques. Okay, Doge Palace. Doge is Italian for Duke, and this is the residence for the Duke. And he also had offices here, but this was upstairs, was his residence. And it is located in Venice, Italy. And some of you all are familiar with the area. I just love these costumes. They're beautiful. They're beautiful in the space. Okay, so, and then this is Gothic. And you can tell because it's got the pointed arch. It's got the flourishes, right? Great detail. This symbol was the symbol of the Duke. They represented it a lot. This is a beautiful brick pattern. All these arches are arced. And we've got kind of spiring things. There's a strong verticality. It's tall. This colonnade out here is supporting the upper level, which is mainly the residence, but it's also allowing on the outside here, it's also kind of acting a little bit like a buttress, so that we get larger windows, because this was completely made out of brick. And this is really beautiful. That was the Duke's sign symbol, and you can see the reflection. Beautiful. But there, your pointed arch. Just some other views of it, because Venice is just amazingly beautiful. Okay, so when most people think about Gothic, certainly in America, they think about Gothic Revival. And it was they brought back Gothic, but they started now applying it to residences. And the painting, American Gothic, was based on this house. That is the house. So it's really wild to see these huge, massive buildings that Gothic was originally invented for, reduced down to these tiny little buildings. Um, in fact, we often hear if you ever heard the term McMansion, it's kind of based on that fact that we create these residences and then we put a lot of stuff on them that was actually originally designed for large buildings, for mansions, and it just doesn't always work well here. I mean, it's a house is falling apart, but they kept it very minimal and clean. And if it were not for that window in the top, that wouldn't be Gothic. So often when you see these types of houses, this is what we're talking about. This is Gothic Revival. You know, we have the pointed arches. You can't see it very well there, but that's pointed. We have the spires, right? We have the tall spaces. We have the towers, this strong verticality going on. There's another example. These are much older. Some of the newer Gothic things I've seen I'm not very fond of, but I didn't really find anything that I thought was worthy showing at this point. Here's an older building as well, but you can see very much Gothic Revival. So that differentiates Gothic from Gothic Revival. Gothic is almost always a very large building at the minimum of a palace, whereas Gothic Revival is the opposite. At the very most, it's a palace, and then all the way down to a very small building. This is all Gothic Revival. Look at that bed. It's very much a lot of wood on the interior. Very dark colors, very neutral palettes. If you think of England, you know, it kind of has that English feel, because it, you know, even though it was primarily French, it does have a English influence in American. And it feels sometimes, in some cases, like even though this is a house, there's a feel to it like it's a church. And that's because Gothic started out originally with religious buildings. Okay, we're going to stop here and wrap it up.